like it. You want a podcast like it? Podcast like it's 1999. Podcast like it. Just podcast like it. Podcast like it's 1999. Podcast like it. You want a podcast like it's 1999.
Hello and welcome to Podcast Like It's 1999, the podcast where we talk about the films of 1999, speeding through the zoo here in 2021. I'm one of your hosts, Kenny Nybart.
And I'm Phil Isco.
And with us today back is Norm Wilner from Now Magazine in Toronto and the podcast Someone Else's Movie or Somebody Else's Movie?
Someone else's movie. You had it.
Someone Else's Movie. Norm, thank you so much for coming back for discussing the filmography of one of our most prolific directors, Clint Eastwood, and one of his least impressive movies, True Crime.
It's a point of fascination for me.
It's a lesser Eastwood. And unlike some directors, I'm just going to start a conversation here. Unlike some directors who are very prolific, like Woody Allen, for instance, even his lesser movies tend to have some cultural footprint. Curse of the Jade Scorpion, for instance, I think people at least know it exists. Hollywood Ending, I think people know it exists and have some kind of understanding that it was there for a moment. I swear to God, before I did this podcast, I did not know that there was a Clint Eastwood movie called True Crime. And I think that's a thing that's kind of unique to Clint, which I want to present this in two ways. One is Clint Eastwood is very clearly to me one of our finest filmmakers, one of the top 5 American filmmakers of the last 30 years, in my opinion. Two, nobody holds that opinion, even though I think it's objectively true. He, maybe because of his politics, maybe because he kind of was a pretty boy actor, particularly in Westerns. I think, and just even though the fact that he won 2 Oscars for 2, kind of unimpeachably brilliant movies, I do think that there is this thing that leaves him out of the Scorsese, Spielberg, even Fincher, kind of even Spike Lee conversation of the great American filmmakers. So, what do you guys think about that?
Norm?
I mean, I think it would be a better argument if he had stopped working like at around 2006, 2007. The problem with Eastwood is that he works when he doesn't have anything to say. He makes a movie a year because he likes to work. And same with Woody Allen, really. And these are both cases of people whose overall body of work actually diminishes their accomplishments the longer it stretches on, just because Eastwood, I am fascinated by Clint Eastwood as a filmmaker because he absolutely has an aesthetic. He has an interest in things. He has great screen presence that he knows how to use better than almost any other filmmaker he's ever worked with, which is really saying something because actors are almost always blind to their own abilities when they become filmmakers. He understands his own iconography, but he doesn't care that much. He just, I've met him. I've interviewed him in a press conference setting once, and it was incredibly frustrating. I've talked to people who've worked with him because he's a smart man who doesn't want to deviate from what he wants to do. He just wants to tell the story in front of him. He wants to relate the anecdote in front of him. He wants to go with the plan, whatever the plan is, not deviate. And you can tell when he directs actors, you can tell in his shot compositions, he doesn't, Peter Morgan, who wrote Hereafter, which was the junket that I did and where I met Eastwood.
A movie that doesn't exist.
Barely.
Yeah, barely exists.
Again, like True Crime, you can maybe remember a couple of shots.
Mm-hmm. I remember the poster.
Yeah, I remember
Hereafter
the poster too.
or for True Crime?
Yeah.
I'm telling you, I did not know True Crime existed.
Yeah, no, I saw True Crime. I was at the press screening. I saw it at a preview screening at the Plaza Cinema in Toronto of blessed memory, underneath a shopping mall downtown.
Yep.
And the only thing I remember 21 years later watching it again, the only scene I remembered is the scene with Dennis Leary, James Woods, and Clint Eastwood in a room yelling at each other, because it's the only time the film is just weird and unpredictable and the energy's right.
100%.
Stop fucking Bob's wife, he doesn't like it, is a great line, brilliantly delivered, says everything, and actually has nothing to do with the story the movie is telling. Like that's the contradiction. And maybe that was it. Maybe it's just like, you know what? I want to make a movie based on this book. And the novel had been knocking around for a while, Andrew Klavan's book, which is apparently like a Carl Hyacin style journalism.
Is it based
detective
on
comedy?
a true story? Am I crazy?
No, it's
okay, it's
fictional.
not. Okay.
I mean, there are lots of crusading journalists trying to overturn death row execution kind of stuff.
But they changed stuff from the book, obviously, in its adaptation, which we'll talk about a little bit, because there were some significant changes that I think are somewhat interesting that Ebert even points out in his review.
Yeah, and the zoo scene is there, which again, is like one of those things where when you see that, it's just like, why is this in this movie? Tonally, this makes no sense. But then apparently the book is sort of a comic look at this sort of story.
The zoo scene is one of my favorite scenes. It's so crazy,
and that's his own daughter, which
it
adds
is.
to the sense of the insurance waivers that must have been necessary.
I mean, I was watching this film and I was thinking about, because Kenny and I have talked sort of loosely about Clint over the years, just on apropos of whatever, just on text and what have you. And I think we both
how
have.
Can you not, right? Like he's a massive footprint.
Yeah, he's a huge filmmaker. He's left a huge a footprint. And like you said, he always has a movie. So on some level, he's always sort of in the consciousness. But I think that Kenny and I have similar feelings about him in the sense of him being incredibly important. And yet at the same time, I completely agree with you, Norm, that you sense that he doesn't necessarily care about the movie that much. Like he cares enough in the sense that he hopes it's good, right? But like we are talking about a filmmaker who, you know, there's a classic Clint story from In the Line of Fire, which admittedly he wasn't directing, so this might have something to do with it. But they were shooting a wide shot of Rene Russo and him walking around the Washington Monument or something. And they shoot a take, and Wolfgang Peterson, who was the director, turns to Clint and gives him some notes. And Clint was like, "Was I in focus?" He's like, "Yes." "Could you hear me?" "Yes." "Then we're moving on." And I feel like that really just is Clint Eastwood. And and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like the guy knows what he's doing. He gets it done. He moves on. But to your point, there'll be like a shot in Jersey Boys, which I saw in the theater, Lord knows why.
It's terrible.
And there's a shot where one of the kids, and not a kid, like a teenager, looks right down the barrel of the lens, and you got to be like, Clint, get another take, dude.
Yeah, there's a moment in Hereafter where one of the child actors flubs a line and keeps going. I'm pretty sure there's one in True Crime too. There's a stammer that Isaiah Washington has towards the end, but it plays like he's nervous, so they kept it. Yeah. But well, this is one of the, like Peter Morgan I got to talk to him separately on the Hereafter junket, just one-on-one. And he told me that he wrote this thing like this. This is a script about the question of what happens after death. And it's about people grappling with it at various stages of their life. Like they're twin brothers. One of them gets killed in a car accident. The other one is convinced he can still feel him. Matt Damon is a medium who meets, is it Cecile de France, a young woman who survived the tsunami and the Boxing Day tsunami in the South Pacific.
Okay. Yeah.
Indonesia, I guess. And she doesn't understand why she lived, and she sort of takes comfort in him. And all these stories. And Morgan told me that he knew a friend who died. He had a friend who died in the 7/7 bombings, which are in the film in London. And he wrote the script as a way of grappling with his lack of closure and his inability to understand everything. And he gave it to Steven Spielberg because he was working with him on something. Mm-hmm. And Spielberg said, "Oh, it's not for me, but I think Clint might like it." And so it goes to El Paso. Eastwood decides he wants to do it and tells Morgan, "We're shooting this next month. You know, like, who do you have in mind?" "I think Matt Damon for this role." And Morgan was flabbergasted. He said, "Do we, like, that was it wasn't even a first draft. That was ideas. Let's rewrite it. And I want this, and I want to try to this." And Eastwood's response was, and this is a quote, "I don't do blue pages." He doesn't rewrite. He doesn't care. And maybe that is, I don't know that that's arrogance. Maybe that's confidence of a filmmaker who's been working for so long that he knows what he likes about a script and wants to do it. But also, he doesn't do second takes. He shoots rehearsals, and you can always tell. Like, you can always tell when he's working with actors.
I want to defend his style.
Yeah, I was.
Sometimes
everything we're talking about, because all right, this is a luxury. This is a privilege that only people like Clint Eastwood have had. Only people with 2 Oscars and who started their career with Play Misty for Me and Josie Wales and Pale Rider, and proved at a pretty young age. I mean, he was in his 40s, but early in his career that he knows what he's doing on low budgets. He knows what he's doing on mid-sized budgets. He makes money. He's Clint Eastwood. It's a luxury, but it's what I personally strive to do as a writer. To write something, it costs me nothing. So I can do this in a way that doesn't really, exude privilege, but still I do have the privilege to work whenever I want. So to some extent. So all I'm saying is I like the make the bad pancakes and throw them out theory, which is I like the Woody Allen, Clint Eastwood. I'm going to make a film every year. I work to live. I live to work. If nothing comes across my desk that blows me away, like Letters from Iwo Jima or whatever the last film you think was amazing, I'm still going to get out there and I'm still going to put something down on celluloid. And it may not be great, but I'm going to go the next day. I'm going to come back and do a great one. So when I look at Clint's filmography, I'm down to throw out the ones that don't count and just keep the 15 to 20 excellent movies he made, and just ignore the other ones. And I think that's the price of doing business with Clint and the price of being a Clint fan. Again, they're not all going to be Fincher, where they're all basically, if not perfect to us, perfect to him, to some extent. But I just, there are a couple of theories I have, particularly when it comes to writing TV, which you need to be fast about. One is, I know people make fun of George Bush for the quote, you may not always agree with the decisions I made, but you can't deny that I made the decisions. I think that there's wisdom in that, which is the worst decision you can make is no decision. And I like the idea that you make the decision and you move forward. When I'm in a writer's room, I always say, for the most part, all these decisions are equal. All these decisions that characters can make are equal. What matters is how we do them. So to argue about he wouldn't do this and he wouldn't do that and she wouldn't go here and they could. Let's see what happens. So I like that about Clint, that he makes decisions and moves on, makes decisions, moves on. And sometimes it's something that I think is brilliant and wonderful and lovely, like Sully. And sometimes it's something like True Crime, where a lot of decisions don't work. And sometimes you wind up with situations where Clint just missed the guy looking down the barrel of the camera. Which is unfortunate, but that's the price to do business as well.
Right.
So,
but isn't that the problem, though? If you only use your first take, aren't you deciding not to make a decision? Aren't you not doing anything to change the output?
My understanding is he does one or 2 takes, but yes. But I do think Clint is a extreme example of this theory, and I do think some of it is I don't know when this is all going to end for me. There's certainly less care with a movie like Gran Torino or The Mule than there was with a movie like Unforgiven, where every shot is perfectly composed.
Well, that's it, right? That's what I mean about getting farther away from the masterpieces, from the good stuff. I would argue, I think the last film that he made that was truly great was probably Letters from Iwo Jima. It's certainly the last time he challenged himself.
I mean, I like Sully. I like Gran Torino.
Good. You know what? Richard Jewell's not bad. But it's not bad because the last 10 years of Clint Eastwood's movies have all been this sort of monochrome, single piano key minimalism.
I want to also kind of defend him a little bit from a slightly different angle too, because watching this film and knowing his very, let's just say, cavalier way of making films, sure. I think that sometimes that creates magic. Right? Sometimes there's something really magical about the throwawayness of the way he does things. I think we can all safely say that most lines should be thrown away, right? And I don't mean in the garbage. I just mean in the sense of said in a way that doesn't feel important, said in a way that feels like
sometimes,
right.
Deliberate, naturally. Sure, absolutely.
Deliberate, natural, right, genuine, what have you. And I think he's very good at that. And sometimes the material works incredibly well for that style of making a film. And
sometimes it doesn't. And I think that's
sometimes it doesn't. Yeah. And I think that, I do think that, to your point, Kenny, and to your point as well, Norm, he does push himself. And when the planets align and he knows, I think, when he recognizes I've got something truly great in my hands, like I've got a script here that I know I can absolutely kill. I mean, if it is Unforgiven or if it is $1 Million Baby or whatever it is, I think he knows that. And then other times I think it's a job and he's just like, I just want to work. But watching this film, I was sort of hit with, there are kind of moments of magic. There are some scenes that are, I think, quite powerful and quite well done in this film when his style works incredibly well. And then there's other times where the film just feels downright lazy, you know, where you're just like, he just doesn't care. And he's just like, I just, let's just get the shot. I want to talk for a second here just about, because Kenny mentioned a little bit about his earlier career. I want to mention sort of the swath of films that he's doing sort of post Unforgiven in the late 90s, early 2000s, where he does A Perfect World, which I know Kenny really loves, which I have seen only once many years ago, so I need to rewatch that. Yeah, I love Bridges of Madison County. I actually think it's a fucking masterpiece.
But Perfect World is definitely my favorite Clint movie, but it's within me, the ways these 89 movies are. So I'm not even sure it's one of his better movies, but I'm crazy about that film.
I think it is. I think those three films, Unforgiven, A Perfect World, and The Bridges of Madison County, are sort of this crucible of. Well, this is the thing I asked him about at the press conference for Hereafter. I'm going to keep going back to this story because it's my only Clint Eastwood story.
Sure, please.
But I believe, and I will argue this, I can really argue this for hours, that his thing, whether he knows it or not, the movies that he casted himself in from Unforgiven onward are all movies about aging and remaining relevant. They're all movies about still doing the right thing or the good thing for society, even when you are no longer considered viable. And part of that is simply because Clint Eastwood is getting older and just refusing to stop playing these roles, right? Like True Crime is a perfect example of this because everyone is constantly telling him he's washed up and useless. And the meditation for me of True Crime is even assholes can save the day. Like this guy has no redeeming qualities except that he's right, except that he refuses to let go. He only got this story because he was trying to sleep with the woman who was working on it. He's 2 months sober or 3 months sober. He's just crawled out of the bottle. He only finally wins because he gets drunk and decides again, like he goes full bastard, and that's what lets him finish the job. It's this fascinating argument that takes place over 15 years. And I think it goes as far as maybe Blood Work, maybe even as far as Gran Torino, where he's arguing that he's still vital. Like he's
Trouble with the Curve as well.
Trouble with the Curve, that one's.
I know it is direct, but
yeah.
I agree with you. I agree with you completely, Norm. Every movie he's done, including Unforgiven, so that's almost 30 years ago, is about staying relevant. I would even say you look back, the Dirty Harrys are about that. Right?
Yeah, but that's not a question of age, right? Like that's a question of point of view.
Temperament.
But it's all, it's obviously all of it is Clint Eastwood being right. He's rarely ever played a villain in his own movies, or even someone like True Crime is, I think, as close as he gets to playing someone of questionable character. I mean, William Munny's a killer, but for a good reason in the movie.
But doesn't this all come back sort of
this? Sorry. Yeah. I was going to say, and I just asked him this point blank in roughly as nervous and halting a way as I just did it here, and he just didn't want to answer it. He's just like, he actually made a joke of it and just kind of went, "What?" and pretended he couldn't hear me. And bless him, Matt Damon called him out and said, "No, you answer that question. That's a good question." And so I owe Matt Damon a fruit basket. But what did he answer? He was vague and meandering. And basically he turned it into saying that he's not going to quit anytime soon, and got a big round of applause from the journalists. Which, of course, Clint Eastwood at he would have been 70 telling you he's not going to stop. Good for him. Good for him. But I don't think he wants to think about it. I think that's the point of it. And that's why True Crime works as well as it does, because it's messy. But the Crusader Clint thing that he's been doing his whole career is embodied in this film. It's about a guy who cannot do anything right except the thing that people count on him to do, which is save someone's life. And
it does all seem to draw like a straight line back to the Westerns, right? Like it all comes back to that sort of, and again, that's not a judgment, but it does feel like, that's where he cut his teeth. That's where he sort of built this persona. And it all feels like those Western tropes, again, not a negative, feel kind of in the DNA of so many things that he's done, which is why when I feel like he takes a swing, I mean, A Perfect World, again, forgive me, Kenny, I haven't seen it in a long time, but Costner's playing a villain in that film, is he not? Is he playing like basically a kidnapping murderer?
He's a bad
It's
guy.
interesting. It's interesting you should say that, right? Like,
Yeah.
yes, Kevin Costner's playing a villain and a bad guy, but there's also the core relationship of this movie, which is, kind of this guy regaining his humanity by taking care of this vulnerable child. And I think, as you're talking about Norman, and the thing that I kind of kept going back to, and part of the reason I find Clint so fascinating is so many of his movies. First of all, there's this great little monologue James Woods gives about issues, right?
Yeah.
About we put these issues out in the newspaper only because we want to sell things to people in a palatable way, but all they really want is sex and blood and et cetera, et cetera. And I think Clint is presenting that in such a way to get the audience thinking about the way he presents his films, because so many of Clint's films are about issues, and in almost all of his films, I think he's on the right side of the issue. Right? I think he's on the right side of the issue here. I think he's on the right side of the issue in $1 Million Baby. I think he's the right side of the issue of Changing. I think he's the right side of the issue pretty much all of his movies. And I think there's the Clint character is this version of masculinity that I think we all, or certain white masculinity, that I think we all wanted to believe was everybody. Right? So,
like an aspirational manhood sort of thing. Like if you were righteous enough that you could be this
moral, yeah. Where when it comes to his own life, there's a Bill Clinton thing, right? They may be a total piece of shit in their own life, but when it comes to the rest of us, they understand the difference between right and wrong. Mm-hmm. And storytelling generally relies on the idea that your hero has a working moral compass. So whether or not they're a hero or an anti-hero or a tragic hero who's betrayed their working moral compass, it makes sense. And I think Clint Eastwood's characters always have a working moral compass. What's so upsetting to me is I think that this film, I actually love parts of this film. I love that Clint is calling himself out, calling out characters like this, making it very clear that what he's doing, particularly with Mary McCormick in the beginning, but a lot of the other things he's doing are morally wrong. But in the end of the day, he's a value add to society. What's so upsetting to me is all these people now who are prominent in society who have not working moral compasses, who are outright villains, who are the anti-Clints, who in the end of the day have chosen villainy or don't understand right and wrong. And I think for a person like Clint, because Clint has given interviews, he can't really understand the Trump thing either. I think for a person like Clint, what's happening in the Republican Party has got to be so discombobulating. This idea that at the end of the day, these people aren't protecting the vulnerable. These people aren't on the side of right. So that really affected me in its own way that, I want my bad guys to look like Clint Eastwood. I want my bad guys in the end of the day to, I correctly identify villains and problems, and we can at least work on, ways to solve the problems instead of, denying reality.
Yeah, I think it's a weird movie. I mean, Kenny and I texted a little bit about it, and it definitely is trying to say something, even in a sort of messy or somewhat, messy is the wrong word, if anything, maybe in too simplistic a fashion. I think that it's a fascinating movie. I think that it also falls in a strange period in his career. He's got Absolute Power in 97.
Yeah.
Which he
which
stars
I
in.
really, really don't like.
And he's got Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which he directs, is not in,
terrible.
which is
Yeah.
not good.
Bad
It's
run.
weird.
Oh, Kevin Spacey of it. It was a bad movie.
Sure.
Like,
And also like a hip
just
book.
doing like a movie a week, basically, just
Yeah.
grinding through his scripts like it was television.
And they're giving him the best IP. Bridges
of Madison County and Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil are huge books.
Those three, because Absolute Power was a really big book too.
Was a big deal, yeah.
Those were the biggest books that anyone could adapt at that time. They're very, very different from each other.
Yeah,
right.
Well, he had that. he had that angle too. As he got older, his audience stayed with him as opposed to dropping off, the way a lot of them do. A lot of like middle-aged to senior audiences will just kind of diffuse and go off and find other things. And Eastwood's people are Eastwood's people for life. Like they're still watching his movies now. They're 80 and 90, and he's 70 and 80.
Well, he's a a bearing wall at Warner Brothers. I mean, he's he's been basically allowed to do essentially whatever he wants for the better part of 30, 40 years. But he does.
When was Malpaso established? 76 with Josie Wales?
I think it was in the 70s.
And he's been on the ever since.
So he does Midnight Garden Good and Evil, which is not good, in 97. He does True Crime in 99. Then in 2000, he's got Space Cowboys. 2002, he's got Bloodwork. And then in 2003, he's got Mystic River. 2004, $1 Million Baby. So he does those two back to back, put him obviously back in sort of, I mean, if the Academy Awards mean anything, they certainly put him back in the good graces of that, but also just in terms of critical acclaim and all of the various things that, that people clamor for.
And it's return on investment for Warner, right? Because he's not expensive. And if they go through, like Woody Allen, if you go through 5 or 6 duds and then something comes along and gets 4 or 5
this
Oscars,
one,
it's worth it.
This one wasn't cheap. This one was 55 and it came in at 16 million. So like they took a bath on True Crime. Sorry,
$55 million and a $60 million gross, or 16? I didn't.
16.
Yeah, that makes way more sense.
They took a bath on this one.
What's interesting when you run through Clint's career as a director is, again, he doesn't. I believe he directed his first film at 38, something like that. Play Misty for me was like 38 or maybe a little older.
41, I think, because he was born. I just looked this up. He was born.
So 40. Okay, so 41, he directs his first film. Not old for a filmmaker, quite young actually, but that was in the 70s.
Yeah,
and then by the end of the 80s, he's doing Dirty Harry sequels. I think he's basically declared dead at that point as a filmmaker. Comes back with Unforgiven in 92. Has this great run in the middle of the 90s. Then we're in the middle of another period where Clint is declared dead as a filmmaker, right? Comes back in 2003, 2004, and the 2 war films in 2006. Biggest filmmaker in the world. Then, in the end of this decade, kind of declared dead as a filmmaker again.
It's like Changeling, Invictus, Hereafter, J. Edgar. Jersey Boys.
It's like we went too far with this guy. We're done with this guy. Like, he's lost his fastball. Then he makes Gran Torino, right? Like right around then?
Wait, no, he makes American Sniper in 2014, which is a gargantuan hit.
American Sniper, and Sully's right around then. This guy again, and then he comes back in his fucking 80s, and he's the hottest filmmaker. I'm telling you, there are at least four distinct periods where people are like,
he's done. Yeah, he's done.
The Clint thing was fun. He won enough. Whoa, he's back. He's done. And not just he's back, like he made fucking Midnight Paris. He came back and made the biggest original studio movie, like, of all fucking time, or at least the last 20 years. American Sniper is one of the biggest success stories of the last 20 years. It's crazy what this guy has done.
Also, it's interesting to harken back to a little bit, Norm, what you were saying about the Spielberg Hereafter thing, right? Because Spielberg almost does American Sniper. Now, what's Spielberg's American Sniper versus what Clint's American Sniper? Two very, these are obviously, one's a Republican, one's a Democrat. These are two very different perspectives on this, on this man, right? So I'd be genuinely curious to see what Spielberg's version of American Sniper is, obviously, versus Clint's. I would argue there's a reason why Clint's made so much money. I think we all know that the far right propped this film up as being,
it was a movie of the moment. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it was a very different thing. But again, what's also interesting about Clint is that I would argue he doesn't really weaponize his politics. Like, I don't think that this man, like, there's a version where he's on Fox News talking about American Sniper. And that just never happened, which, again, makes me respect the guy that much more to say, like, listen, I'm a Republican, moderate Republican is my assumption. And
he's a libertarian. Like, he's a registered libertarian.
Yeah. Well, he thinks he's a libertarian. He's a Republican. It's most libertarians are Republicans that insist that they're not. just because it's a way of distancing themselves from the direction the Republican Party has taken in the last 40 years. Like since Reagan.
I'm with you, Norm. I think libertarians are, coward Republicans.
They're lying.
But they do. But there is some value to the idea that they don't they don't ascribe to that label. And
sure, correct.
I think that the libertarian streak runs through his movies. I think the right to end your own life on your own terms is a very libertarian idea. I think a government not being able to kill its own citizens is a libertarian idea. I think libertarians, for the most part, 30% of their ideas, kind of coincide, 30, 35, 40% coincide with progressivism because, it's really these ideas generally are about personal liberty. And I think we progressives feel the same way when it comes to our own lives.
I think that what makes Eastwood's politics so murky in his films is that he doesn't reshape the scripts. Like it comes back to not rewriting. He doesn't impose himself on the movies he makes. In the text stage, when they're being created as narratives, he shoots the script. And that means that, like, the thing I find most fascinating, because I don't really think American Sniper is a particularly good movie. It's kind of like, it's the same usual mess of lame detail and indifferent direction. But Bradley Cooper's performance is actively arguing against the heroism that Eastwood is trying to put on him, because Cooper is playing the depression and the bipolar and the anger and the rage and the confusion. And that's a fascinating performance. And I think Spielberg's movie would have actually been more in line with that, and it might have made it a lesser experience, because you're watching the film kind of insist that this guy's a straight up hero, and Cooper just refusing to play him that way.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and truthfully, I'm not sure that Spielberg's version of this film is effective or I mean, there's a reason why he didn't do it. I think ultimately, I think that, but I do think that you talk about sort of Clint not imposing or not rewriting. I believe that to be true. I'll say that with this film, with True Crime, he did make one sort of imposition on it, which is that he wanted to switch the race of the character from the book. In the book, he's white. And by that, I mean the prisoner that Isaiah Washington's character was white. And he felt that the film, had more to say if there was sort of more race involved in it. I don't necessarily disagree, but I also don't necessarily feel like he's, got a ton to say about the race component of this either, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, but I understand why he wanted to do it. But did you think that he? Okay.
I think I know why he wanted to do it.
Okay.
I think he wanted to be able to say to that black mother that the prisoner on death row is black too. And I think what he also wanted to do was was make this argument that he's been making in the media for about 20 years, which is essentially people, speaking as Clint, people like me aren't racist. And stop calling me racist, because I'm not a racist, right? Ask anyone I know, I'm not a racist. And I think that this is a very personal issue for white men of a certain age. This idea of I've been racially progressive my whole life. I've never actively, said anything racist. How dare you call me racist?
Yeah.
And this idea of I will not bother to even listen to the arguments that I or people like me are part of a white patriarchal society, because I know it's in my heart. Mm-hmm. Now, I really think that's where Clint comes from. I really think Clint goes to bed. I believe
that to be true.
I think he goes to bed with a clear conscience, and I think he thinks he's been, value add when it comes to the racial fight.
It was a big deal in 75 in the Iger sanction when he cast Vanetta McGee as the love interest, who was a black woman in 1975 in a Bondish spy movie that he played the lead in. The movie's ridiculous, but that was important then, and it probably was something he took a great deal of pride in.
I think that there are a lot of people over the last 50 years who have been both part of the solution and part of the problem.
Yeah.
And I think,
if you've done any one good thing in your mind, you're a champion, right? It doesn't matter what else you may have unconsciously done.
Right.
Yeah. I think Clint Eastwood absolutely sees himself as a guy who came up from nothing and is, still an underdog, even though he's been doing what he does very specifically for 50 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, to the Clint of it and the racial discussion of it, I think that's what 2020 has been about. I think that's what the social justice movement in 2020 has been about. I think everybody understands that there are actual villains out there who are actually working against, the advancement of people of color.
Sure.
I think that the other part is that there are people who are just refusing to listen to the arguments because of their privilege and comfort. And I think Clint falls into that category. And he's 90 and he's never going to change. But I think that's why I didn't have like white savior issues with this movie the way I do with a lot of other movies like this. It didn't have that sheen on it to me, or sheen's not the right word, that cloud over it, the way it does in other movies, because I don't think that's where it came from. But I do think that Clint's making a point that I'm on the right side of this issue and race is a part of this issue. So
yeah, I completely agree, and I would also second the fact that I didn't think of this as white savior either. I mean, we talked a little bit about the white savior component in Green Mile many moons ago.
Oh, yeah,
but that's what
like,
you know
that's
what I mean.
Cartoon of itself, sure.
Sure. And it also mixes in all sorts of other unfortunate tropes about magical African American characters and any number of other things. So that film is very different. But this film, to your point, Kenny, I think remains grounded enough. And again, this comes back to sort of stylistically the choices that Clint makes. The movie feels pretty lived in, all things considered. You know what I mean? I think that it's. I have my issues, and we'll talk about those as well. But I think that the film is surprisingly effective when it's kind of playing itself pretty like calmly. The problems get into when it takes kind of big swings. Kenny just decided to leave.
I never decided to leave. I just closed my door. He calls me on every episode as if I'm deciding to leave.
I thought you were muffling a sneeze, frankly. So,
but I think that the film, I think the film works a lot better when it's not like dialed up to 11. When it gets really dramatic, I feel like unfortunately
it becomes a joke movie at the end of The Player, which is like, kind of
exactly.
kind of a weird thing to do, 9 years after The Player was an actual movie that made fun of this exact trope.
Clint Eastwood didn't see The Player. I mean,
Clint Eastwood never watched The Player.
No, there's no way.
I can actually believe that Clint Eastwood and Robert Altman were each other's antithesis.
Yeah, either end of the spectrum.
Because Altman's arcs and peaks were always a couple of years ahead of Eastwood's. Like he would just go make terrible movies that nobody saw. Like that string of stage adaptations in the 80s after Secret Honor, and then come roaring back in like 91 or 92 with The Player.
And Shortcuts. It's funny though. I do think that the Venn diagram of the two of them is that they're both curmudgeonly old white guys.
They're old. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're like Altman's the pothead and Eastwood's the one who smokes.
Yeah.
Proper tobacco, hand rolled cigarettes or something.
Which famously he won't do except in a movie.
Yeah. I know it's great.
But he really, he is. He's like he's a phony when it comes to that.
I'm going to read the synopsis of this film really quick for our listeners. Journalist Steve Everett, played by Clint Eastwood, has been sober 2 months, but things are still going badly. Steve's marriage to Barbara, played by Diane Venora, is barely holding together, and his editor, Dennis Leary, hates him since Steve has been having an affair with his wife. A chance assignment finds Everett interviewing death row inmate Frank Beecham, played by Isaiah Washington. When Everett uncovers evidence indicating Beecham may be innocent, he must race against time to uncover the truth. True Crime opened on March 19th, 1999, in third place behind Forces of Nature and Analyze This. It would go on to make $16 million on a $55 million budget. It's got 54% on Rotten Tomatoes from critics, 49% from audiences. I'm going to read a very brief, or not very brief, but a little bit of Ebert's review. It's a doozy. Clint Eastwood's True Crime follows the rhythm, 3 stars, by the way, follows the rhythm of a newspaper man's day For those who cover breaking news, many days are about the same. When they begin, time seems to stretch out generously towards the deadline. There's leisure for coffee and phone calls, jokes, and arguments. Then a blip appears on the radar screen, an assignment, seemingly a simple assignment. Then the assignment reveals itself as more complicated. The reporter makes some calls. If there's anything to the story at all, a moment arrives when it becomes to the reporter the most important story of the war in the world. His mind shapes the form it should take. He badgers sources for missing pieces. The deadline approaches. His attention focuses. The finish line is the only thing visible, and the facts, story, deadline, and satisfaction all come at the same time. A deadline reporter's day, in other words, is a lot like sex.
There's the Roger Ebert I know.
There's the Roger Ebert we all know.
Like, I'm going to fantasize about being Jimmy Breslin and then somehow link it back to.
He's so great. I mean, I love how Ebert is. Like he's just so great, you know.
And you can totally see this film playing into Roger's. Like, I barely knew him. Into his legend of himself, like the self-embiggening thing that he was doing at that point. And
totally,
more power to him. But if you come out of this movie thinking you've seen yourself in any form, you're just not doing your life right.
Norm, have you worked as a deadline journalist or a reporter in that respect?
Not really. I've reported stuff to Deadline, but it's entertainment industry stuff. I once had a front page story one time in the Star about the type of seats that were coming to movie theaters. And I remember thinking even then that it was the dumbest thing they'd ever asked me to do, but it was basically because nobody else wanted to do it and I was freelance. So you never say no. But no, I can't. I mean, I've been in a newsroom. I've worked in a newsroom, and it's fun. It is fun. It's also, he gets the quiet bitchiness of everybody. Like every single character in that space wants to be doing something else. And I'm assuming it's straight out of the book because it's so unlike Eastwood to appreciate that sort of exchange. But the scenes with the style columnist who only speaks in headlines, but now sounds like she's vomiting out SEO, is amazing. That's just beautiful.
Yeah, I have to say that, and he did this pretty well. I got to be honest, in Richard Jewell as well. He covers. I like the way that Clint sees a newsroom, the way he sees. I don't want to say the way he sees media necessarily, but I guess the way he sees media being generated. Let's put it that way. I found those scenes, they crackled, like you mentioned, the James Woods, Dennis Leary, Clint Eastwood. It's those are three guys in a room that you probably would watch. I mean, like, would want to watch what they have to say to each other. And he is successful in doing that. Weirdly, the movie doesn't feel like a reporter movie to me, if that makes any sense. It's more of a
24-hour ticking clock story that has no pace, which is amazing. Like, it's just, there's that scene where the warden and his guards are having lunch, and you're like, what time is he's already had time to bang Bob's wife, to go in late. Has he been to the zoo yet? What time of day is this happening?
Yeah, it's like in 24 when Jack Bauer does a million things in the span of 24 hours, and you're like, I'm not really sure this all can be crammed into one day.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, what you guys seem to be getting at is it's such a bad movie. I totally feel like I was watching the movie being like, this is like such a bad movie, and yet I liked it. I feel that way. Like there's something about like the Eastwood house style or lack thereof, the point and shoot of it, that feels so unfussy and unprecious that I really enjoy being with him as he covers these worlds. As absurd and like dumb and like meandering as this plot can be. I agree with everything you said. This movie sucks, but also kind of is great.
I kind of liked it. I mean, I enjoyed watching it. I wasn't bored necessarily, although it starts a little bit slow.
It's pretty it's like second gear for almost the entire film. And
it
burps into third. But it's comfortable, right? Like there's this
sense of third is a great way of putting it.
It's the only way to get around Dead Man's Curve. Like the fact that there's a place called Dead Man's Curve in Oakland in 1999. There is some sort of sense that and this, I kept thinking about this watching the movie. He's 69. He's playing it like he's 45, and I think part of that is that the character is unaware of how much of a relic he is and how pitiful it is that he's hitting on 23-year-olds who are like, because it's Mary McCormick, she's 30, because you can't cast an actual 23-year-old against Clint Eastwood because it will look like his great-granddaughter. The movie, like, I don't know if he knows it, but the movie knows it, which is really fascinating because it's his movie.
I think that's why I like it. I think that I was shocked by that opening scene, right? Like, or that scene with him and Mary McCormick where he actually gets to kiss her, and she's basically like, "You're disgusting. Like what you just did to me is disgusting."
Yeah. But he's also getting her drunk, and that's what kills her, which is fascinating. The film takes no responsibility for that at all.
And in every, I mean, Norm, you were saying this earlier, but in every interaction, he's a piece of fucking trash.
Oh, yeah. No, he makes every situation worse by
and I think that's part of why I like the movie, because I never felt condescended to, right? Like a lot of these Crusader movies. And I think that it's an interesting thing. We haven't done the movie yet. We will at some point, but Hurricane is kind of a classic white savior movie. The problem with movie. The problem with that movie is, in particular, is it was directed by a Canadian. But the other part of that movie,
no, he says the two Canadians.
I think Kenny is right. I think the biggest problem with the Hurricane and a lot of these other, like, it's Paul Greengrass just made News of the World. I don't know if either of you have seen it yet, but
I'm looking forward to it though.
It's okay, but just as with the Hurricane, like, you've got an outsider coming into a system and showing you everything that's wrong with it, or everything that he thinks he's wrong with it. And
that's why I hate Three Billboards so much. Yeah, I mean, you just like that. Three Billboards
for me because of the caricature of it. Like, everybody in it is an exaggeration, so it's like it's all on the same pitch. But
it felt very like I'm shining the light on you guys. I know what you're all about. But back to the Hurricane. The problem with the Hurricane is it's a true story, right? So
I mean, it was a true story. By the time it became a movie, it's a complete distortion.
No, but I know. But I'm saying just to
I'll be returning for the Hurricane. I can feel
the issue with the Hurricane is, Reuben Carter really was helped by the Innocent Projects, right? The Innocent Project of Canada, I believe.
The Canadians, it was 7 people that are collapsed down to like 3, one of whom is English somehow in the movie. And the other, like, the fault of the movie, the other flaw of the movie too, is that it puts all of his guilt, all of his persecution on Dan Hedeya's character, who didn't exist. Like, Jewison couldn't handle the idea that the system was so corrupt, so he made a villain.
Which is that's the opposite of Clint, right?
Yeah.
The one thing that you could see through Clint's movies, his non-war movies for the most part, the one system he does seem to trust is the defense system. But from the Westerns to the movies about the media to the movies about the government oversight like Sully, is I don't trust these systems. These systems are rotten to the core, which I think what we feel, or at least what I feel. But just back to the point about the Hurricane is, generally these white saviors are so fucking good. They're so fucking good, and I am so fucking condescended to and patronized by being on their righteous journey. They're the Sandra Bullock in Blindside. I know the way journey, and Clint knows nothing in this movie except that he has the ability to go into these rooms, and he has the ability to go into these, to go into these houses, and he has the ability to like just work around the clock and try to get the right thing done. It doesn't matter how much it fucks up his life, and I really love that it fucks up his life. Like, in the end, he has nothing.
About the Hurricane, though, which is that, wasn't there also the whole like Malcolm X component of this too, right? Like Norman Jewison was trying to make Malcolm X for the longest time. Spike Lee obviously was like, no, like don't do that. And thankfully Spike Lee made the film, and it's a masterpiece. The Hurricane feels almost like a reaction against that a little bit too, right? Which is him, Jewison, perhaps looking for some other, not just another movie to work with Denzel Washington on, but perhaps something that he felt he could make that would talk about similar issues.
Well, when he brought it to TIFF, it was the most important movie about race relations ever made, and then we all saw it, and it's like, oh no, it's not.
Yeah, I mean,
went in with like this feeling of this Crusade movie, and it just. It's what happens when you don't actually, again, when you're a stranger to the subject, when you're a foreigner to the world, you just miss the boat.
I also think that and we've sort of talked around this a little bit, this idea in the last hour that we've been talking, but I kind of want to hone in a little bit on Clint Eastwood not quote unquote caring as much about the films that he's making also makes them not feel quote unquote important. Like he doesn't seem to be making important movies, even though he's making movies about important issues. So it does sort of, it's got this push and pull that I do think is fascinating, right? Like I remember sitting down in the theater for $1 Million Baby, having no idea that film was about euthanasia.
Me neither.
And then it happens, and you're like, it just knocks you on your ass.
Yeah. Well,
now
and
again,
it's not about euthanasia, right? Like it's the end of the movie, and it becomes about that because people were shouting
like
about
40
it.
minutes.
Yeah, but it's about the relationship between these two characters and how much he loves her, that he's willing to do that for her and to her. So,
but it speaks.
Issue is in orbit of the story. The story is the reason that he made the movie.
Well, and that's what I think. I mean, there are a bunch of things that make Clint Eastwood a very good filmmaker. He's got a light touch.
I think what Norm just said is what makes him a really good filmmaker. I think he just nailed it. Like, I think that's I of course the movie's about these two characters. And he was obviously taken by this relationship, and it just so happened to end the way it ended in the script that he was given by Paul Haggis. And he didn't shy away from that. I really love that about Clint, because these movies are never actually about the issues. They're actually always about the relationships, or as Norm said in the beginning.
And I would also say that
Clint's relationship with mortality. But yeah, go ahead, Phil.
I would also say too that the best way to get an important issue through to a person who might not be willing to hear that issue is through storytelling, right? It is through making them care about the character, telling a good story, and showing through that, perhaps two sides of a thorny issue, which I think, again, Clint does very well. I mean, I don't think that any of us are necessarily writing for this film, but I would also say that it's a pretty light touch until it's not. But I do think that, I don't know. I think it's sort of exactly what you're saying, Norm, that he's, when push comes to shove, he's a guy who just wants to tell you a story, right? And sometimes he's more interested in the story than others. But I also just want to highlight one other thing that Ebert said in his review that I think is worth noting, because it folds into what we're talking about here. He says, true crime has a nice rhythm intercutting the character's problems at home, his interviews with the prisoner, his lunch with a witness, his unsettling encounter with the grandmother of another witness, and then at the midnight hour of execution draws closer, Eastwood tightens the noose on an inexorably mounting tension. Maybe it's time for a movement in favor of quote-unquote real movies with tempo and character, details and style, instead of action fest with attention deficit disorder syndrome. Clint Eastwood could be an honorary chairman. I think there's something to that as well, a little bit, right? I think the reason people still love Clint Eastwood's movies is because he's one of the few guys that can kind of make these type of movies, right? That can make just an old style, clean movie that where you stand with the characters. He's going to tell you a good story and like that.
Yeah, I don't hold anything against his, like, you could derogatorily call it middlebrow approach, which is just nothing fancy, almost never does anything digitally. There's no effects. Like Space Cowboys is the anomaly because it's got CG spaceships, but it's actually not that. It's a pretty good movie, as these things go. Like, well, no, it's
as far as sending octogenarians into space.
But that's what I mean. On the continuum of the Eastwood films about aging and still being relevant, just the idea that he saw Armageddon and thought, I
could do that.
Yeah. It's the theory works. Like it actually plays.
His worst movies are definitely middlebrow movies. Yeah. His best movies are super highbrow, and the only thing that are keeping it out of that conversation is a film by Clint Eastwood. Right? I don't think you get more. I don't kind of think you get more elevated than Unforgiven. Honestly, I think Unforgiven is such a deep, rich movie that doesn't present itself as such.
But I think if you cast someone else, it's not as powerful either. And he knew that. Like, he bought the script in the 80s and sat on it for a decade until he was old enough to play Willy Wonka convincingly. It's like, that's what I mean about his awareness of his own iconography. Like, that movie is arguing against the Westerns he made with Leone and Don Siegel. And it's incredible because of it. It's because he chose to have this argument with his own history. Right.
I also wanted to say something earlier when you guys were talking about his persona, and how he perceives himself as a sex symbol. I think is also quite interesting. I mean, I think it's interesting that he makes Bridges of Madison County, which is not a Clint Eastwood type vehicle, right? Like, that's not something that you would ever expect him to direct, star in. It's an understanding in himself that he can get there, that he has this sort of quite frankly, this sweetness and this romantic side that you just wouldn't have really associated with him. Yeah. So really, every movie he does after that, even this movie in particular, like the scene he has with his wife is a great scene. It really did make me think about Bridges of Madison County and how he's able to go to those places. And then he has 2 threesomes in the mule, and you're just like, there's a part of me that sometimes maybe he's just like fucking with us. I just don't know that he even like cares about how we perceive him, and he's just having fun with that.
It's a kind of vulnerability and self-deprecating sense
a little
of himself,
bit,
maybe. Yeah. Hopefully, I would like to believe that. Otherwise, the mule is just a huge miscalculation.
I couldn't imagine what life would be like if you were as hot as Clint Eastwood was in the 50s and 60s. Scott Eastwood, his son, is very hot and is like the ugliest man next to old pictures of Clint Eastwood. So to have been that hot and have been like, and you know, his history, he's been married a bunch of times. He's openly cheating on those wives with more beautiful women. Like he has just had women throwing themselves at him his whole life. It must be very weird to all of a sudden be old but still be in fucking great shape. And I don't even know how you come to grips with that particular fact that I no longer am the hottest man in every room I walk into.
Yeah. It should also be said he has
everywhere, right? Because it's on posters and movie stills, and movie theaters are still showing your old self 30 feet high, right?
It should also be said that Clint has a lot of children out of wedlock, some of which that he will not even acknowledge are his children.
One of whom is in this film, and her mother plays the district attorney, right? Like Frances Fisher is. I think they had already stopped being a couple by that point.
4 years after.
4 years after.
Yeah. And she was in another one of his post relationship movies as well. I think she might have been, I can't remember, maybe Garden of Good and Evil, but something like.
But I guess that's good because that means they continued to really. And she brought Bernard Hill over from Titanic, which is still something I don't fully understand. Like, it's just.
Oh yeah, that's right.
This whole movie feels like there's a comfort feel to it, where it's just like Diane Venora was in Bird and gave like probably the best performance of her career in that, and no one.
But Michael McKean is,
and
Michael McKean as the pastor. I just don't know what to make of that performance.
The character is absurd, and the performance is not great. And he's my favorite actor right now because I'm obsessed with Better Call Saul.
Yeah.
But that's another fucking Clint thing where, you know, where me and him are just on the same page. Like, fuck the church. Like, that's a crazy thing for a Republican to put out there, which is like the ultimate villain of this is a smarmy reverend who sneaks into death row to try to coax confessions out of death row inmates.
Yeah, I like the idea too that McKean is the ultimate Eastwood villain because he's just not very good at his job, but he thinks he is. And again, you can see Eastwood in every movie he's ever made as an action hero, just looking at that lieutenant who gets in the way, right? It's Paul Gleason in Die Hard. It's the dick who just shows up and makes everything worse. And I was amazed because I had forgotten McKean was in this film because it's not a memorable performance. But he shows up now, and Kate my wife hadn't seen the film before, and she's like, "That's Jimmy's brother from Better Call Saul." It's like, yeah, just you wait. And there's that moment where he sort of sidles up to the other guards while it's the lunch scene, right? Like he just kind of comes up and tries to join them, and none of them likes him. And it's like that's the kind of storytelling that Eastwood, because he I'm sure his only direction was they don't like you, and he plays it so McKean just plays it beautifully, like this unctuous, intentional kind of, hey, I'm the cool priest, and no one can stand him. And then later he fucks it up for everybody else. Like it's even before we've seen him do anything wrong. Right up until that point, he was just trying to be helpful, maybe in the wrong way, but as far as we could tell, he was trying to do his job. And then you just gradually realize how much of a dick this guy is and how toxic he is to the space he works in. I kind of love that. And then McKean doesn't try to make it sympathetic in the least.
No. I want to throw something else out, which is another kind of, to me, point in Eastwood's favor. Actors love working with him, and why wouldn't you? You only have to do it once or twice.
Yeah, he asks nothing of you, and sometimes you get an Oscar nomination. Why wouldn't anybody?
I mean, all right. There's one way to put it is he asks nothing of you. The other thing is he gives you full autonomy over your performance, right? Sure. You're Bradley Cooper, and you decided to characterize this character in this way, and he lets you go. I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's fundamental to me. I have a hard time, since I've been in this business, I have a hard time looking at performances from actors the same way as I used to. Multiple takes and then the way the film comes together in the edit. I understand, of course, that the actors are making all their decisions, but on set, actors are making dozens of decisions. Actors are making, in the same role, in the same scene, dozens of decisions, and then the director and the editor and the producer are deciding which ones work best for the performance, which ones work best for the film. And that feels to me like in my bones, like you are taking the art away from the artist when you do that to some extent. That film and television actors are less respected in our medium than they are on stage where you got one shot. And I like the idea that you make your choice, you go out there, you perform your choice the way you wanted to make your choice with whatever direction you get from your director and whatever you take from the screenplay and from your co-actors and all the mise en scène around you or whatever. And that's it. And that's the performance. The performance is the performance. So to me, there is something kind of beautiful and natural and organic about that I know not to be true in almost every other film, particularly like a Fincher film where you're doing 150 takes of every scene. And I mean, he's going to like one of them, I guess. And I love Fincher deeply. He's probably my favorite director, but it's a different thing when it comes to acting.
You bring up the acting, and obviously in this film, and we've talked about him a couple times. I didn't know he was in this movie. I didn't know James Woods was in this movie until I pressed play on this movie. And James Woods is one of those guys. I've talked with friends about this, and even David Sims talked about it recently on one of their podcasts. He's one of those guys that I'm very conflicted about now. I enjoy him as an actor. He's in some of my favorite films. As a human, I have issues with him. And the speech he gives in this film that Kenny mentioned earlier, coming out of James Woods' mouth, feels just different now than it would have felt, I imagine, in 1999. But the guy has something, right? Like there's something electric about him. In 99, we get, this film, we have Any Given Sunday
and movies that we're doing.
Suicides. What were the other two?
He was in Play It to the Bone.
Play It to the Bone, that's right.
And there's one other.
But yeah, I mean, like, and the guy's got range. It's just unfortunate that his brain is rotten as a human, and that he's unfortunately lost touch with reality. But in this film in particular, it's clear to me that Clint said, "Do your thing." Like I don't think that there was a lot of direction going on here, and it totally works.
I'd be willing to bet that the Coos line was him because he has a reputation for throwing in a line at the end of every scene. He's very proud of that. I interviewed him about Nixon, so 95.
Oh, wow.
And I did the press junket for that. That was amazing. And and he and I got a one-on-one, and it was this great long conversation. We talked about like Cronenberg and Videodrome and everything, and we just sort of rolled in. And he was really, really proud of how at the end of his scene, like he has this big moment where he leans into the camera and basically says, "We're next," right after the big the beginning of the destruction of the Watergate illusion. And he was really proud of like, we're next. It's like, yeah, what else would you say? I don't know why you're that proud of this improvisation. You were in character and you came up with the next.
You basically said.
And if you follow the logic of the scene in this, his pivot to what are you, accuse now, which is just like nothing else his character says approximates that language or the misogyny. He's been sort of gently ribbing Eastwood about his skills as a coxman, but he's not ever going in the other direction of beating down the women who he's sleeping with. And to suddenly hear that, it's just like, oh, there's James Woods.
There's a moment that I laughed out loud at, and it's not even a line. So Clint tells James Woods that he thinks Beecham is innocent, just as James Woods is about to take a bite from a Snickers
the Snickers bar.
So and the shot holds on him, mind blown, unable to take a bite of the Snickers, cuts away to the prison, comes back, and he is still holding the Snickers and has not taken a bite. What the fuck is going on?
Like that is Joel Cox, Oscar-winning editor, right there.
Yeah,
he just knows how to make that scene play.
Like, what's happening?
Yeah, somebody. I can't remember who it was, but somebody once told me that the value of James Woods is that he's the guy you enjoy, but you don't necessarily like in a movie, and that's like perfect use of him here.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned this scene earlier, Norm, which is it's I guess midway through the film, basically, and Dennis Leary is essentially trying to fire Clint, and James is trying to protect him, but kind of not. Dennis Leary playing this cuckolded, essentially
crazy
husband, which is strange.
Yeah. It's great casting for Leary, right? Because he was just like off of this run of working class hero movies and shows, and to see him play someone with no power and who's just shifting on his feet constantly because he can't figure out where to push his anger, it's a good performance of an unplayable role.
It's a little bit similar to the performance he gives in Thomas Crown Affair as well, where he also seems to be
that was the same year.
Also seems to be powerless.
He's much better in this. Like he's far in Thomas Crown.
He's better used in this, absolutely. But like that scene with and the editor in chief, I don't even know. Like, Alan's the editor in chief, right? Like he's
correct.
Signing editor. The scene with Woods and Leary and Eastwood is sort of like this fascinating preview of where masculinity is going in America, because you have the beta cuck who's the thing now. You have James Woods who will play Rudy Giuliani in a few years, and then become him amazingly. And then Eastwood, who has the Republican convention in his future, but still manages to keep his identity as an independent. And
it's very strange.
It's like some sort of weird MAGA cocktail that no one figured out 21 years later.
And it's analyzing. And it's a fascinating scene to watch. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I watched it sort of in amazement that this sort of lightning in a bottle had been concocted. And I would also say too, it's got real momentum. It obviously speaks to the plot of the film. He finds a way to kind of weasel his way into not getting fired by asking for, a few hours essentially. Right. But it's a very interesting scene. And I'll tell you, one of the other things that I thought was interesting in it is, I mean, I didn't write down the line, but Dennis Leary talking about essentially his relationship with his wife and him being like, if she needs to get outside our marriage, that's her prerogative, and my marriage has nothing to do. Like, it was a very reasoned and sort of logical way of. It was just very interesting. It's just like there's so much going on in this scene to unpack, and yet I'm just like I don't even know why it's in the movie.
Yeah, it's the most progressive moment, right? It's like I refuse to let my personal life influence my judgment. This guy's a dick anyway.
Well, that I love. Yeah. I want to go back to that scene you're talking about, because there's something very unsettling about those three guys in a room together. Like, I have watched many movies with three tough guys in a room, but when the tough guys are Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci, They're Ray Liotta. They're people you can trust, that you know they're not buying into the bullshit. They're not buying into. I can't. It's very unsettling watching James Woods and Clint Eastwood and Dennis Leary and not knowing where they stand when it comes to the material. Now, it shouldn't be, right? This whole enjoying a movie like this and enjoying James Woods' performances is predicated on separating the artist from the art. But those three guys and not having someone to ground yourself with is really, really hard as a nice liberal viewer in 2021.
Well, I think
I also want to say too that the line that tips the scene that makes me really not know where I stand is when Clint tells Dennis to hit him and then hit his wife because she quote unquote likes it. And you're just like, what are we? Where are we? Yeah. Like what's happening? Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? I don't understand what's happening.
I can't tell if that scene is the best written scene in the movie or the worst, because an argument should be like, you know the rule, right? Dramatically, an argument should never be about the thing you're arguing about. It should always be the undertone. It should be the subtext. And this goes everywhere. It's the shoot. What was it? It was William Goldman said that Robert Redford drove him insane writing All the President's Men because he never gave him a direction in which to take the script. He always said, "Don't deprive me of any riches." That was his line, and it drove Goldman crazy. But this is that. Like this is the well. What if they actually have it out? What if they're fighting about this? What if it is about the story, but also about the fact that this guy can't why? Because ultimately, the whole movie's argument comes back to why should we trust Steve Everett to solve this crime, never mind figuring out who really did it. How can you prove this guy didn't do it? And how does this guy do that? Because he's such a total fuck up. Like he's a tornado of disaster who literally cannot take his daughter to the zoo without throwing her bodily out of her throat.
But it's also, I mean, it's
right.
I mean, the scene is, there's no subtext to the scene, really. I mean, there's a little bit, but there's not much. It's overt. Yeah. It's, again, I agree with you, Norm, that it's probably the best scene in the movie, or at least the scene in the movie that's the most sort of odd. Like it jumps out at you. Yeah. And then procedurally, the film itself, like in terms of how Clint puts together, I mean, the procedural part of this movie is not particularly interesting, and it's all kind of handed to him pretty much.
It's lame, but I do think that that's part of it. Like, all right, so your question, Norm,
boredom of going through the research and interviewing people and going to the fact that he obsesses over and over again that people keep saying potato chips. It becomes a mantra. You can't believe that that's the thing that he hooks on, but it is the thing that saves a life.
Yeah. I assume intent, though I find it hard to believe that this was the intention here. To Norm's question, why do we trust Steve Everett? Why do we think Steve Everett can do this? And it seems to me the answer is because he's willing to try, right? And that's kind of all it takes. And a point I wanted to make earlier is one of the reasons why this doesn't bother me from a white savior point of view the way so many other movies like this bother me is because it makes the white savior so incredible. So it's not so much about the white person saving it. It's like this hero, this unique hero who happens to be white, is the only person that can save this doomed black person. This movie seems to be saying that any white person could have used their privilege if they were willing to look past what's going on here to solve this case. Not only that, like one of our worst white people was able to put this together because one of our worst white people was able to fail up to the position where he can, go into these rooms and put this together. But the fact that the mystery isn't particularly deep and layered and compelling, I think makes that case. And what this movie's secretly about is like.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt. I just have to run outside for 1 second. Okay, I'm just going to mute myself so this won't make a noise, but I'll be right back.
Okay, no problem. Should I keep going?
Yeah, why not?
What this movie is secretly about is good allyship. Good allyship. This is how you can be an ally. You could use your privilege to advance the cause of people who do not have the same privilege as you. Obviously, it's incredibly heightened. It's a crazy situation. But this is how Clint is making that argument, I think.
Yeah, this movie, it's funny. When you texted me last night when you were like, it's weird. And I was like, because at that point, I think I was about 45 minutes into the film, and I was like, well, it's not that weird. It's just kind of weird. And then by the end, I was like, yeah, this movie is just straight up strange. Like, what it's you got 3 screenwriters, 2 work together, 1 seemed to work independently. It does feel a little bit kind of cobbled together. Some stuff seems to pop more than others. There does seem to be a little bit of some dissonance of voices and what have you. But I ultimately think that if he had just dialed down the end a little bit and not gone so the player, quite frankly, I think this film, I mean, I'm still going to give this a reasonably okay grade, I think, when everything is said and done. But like, I think this film could have been actually pretty great if Clint had applied himself a little bit more. Like, again, only seen A Perfect World once. It was a long time ago. But there's an interesting parallel here in the sense of like, if he had, coming off of Unforgiven, I think he really applies himself to A Perfect World. I think it feels like, post Oscar,
he's also not really in it. I mean, he's
right,
in it,
right?
But like, he's very much a supporting character,
right? But this film is coming after a couple duds, a couple things that don't really connect. This feels a lot like a film of a guy who's like, I don't know anymore,
Well, racing to save a prisoner on death row.
Yeah, racing down Dead Man's Curve.
Not a great, I know where a character died earlier, drunk driving. Racing to save a guy on death row is such a, questionable move. Like, it's a questionable storytelling move. It's a questionable ticking clock. Like, the whole thing trivializes everything that comes before it. And it's a hard thing to stomach.
Well, especially the way he draws it out, too. I mean,
and then the music is crazy, too. The score is crazy by the end.
And they're spending the whole movie explaining the way you kill someone. And, they do that Dead Man Walking as well. But that only serves to make you feel even worse as all 3 of these things are administered. This actually serves to explain the mechanics that he's going to upend and put you in a position where you say, oh, I know that, like, the second one paralyzes him and he can't breathe, and now they give him enough. What's happening? So the movie kind of takes itself too seriously to have such a silly ending. But I'm not going to take it that seriously, and I'm kind of okay with the silly ending.
I'm kind of I mean, it's I can't help but think I couldn't help but think of Dead Man Walking as I was watching this, obviously a little bit, which is a film again I have not rewatched since I saw it in the theater back in 95.
I remember being in the theater in 95 and just being destroyed by that movie.
It was a very harrowing experience. I remember sitting in the theater and watching that film. This is, I think we all less so, but I think we also have to recognize that like Clint is still sort of a popcorn filmmaker in a way. Like he still knows the tropes that he's playing in, and he still knows how to like, give you what he thinks you want a little bit from time to time. And the end of this film just feels like a little bit of a miscalculation of veering a little bit too far down, the populist quote unquote road of thinking that this is what people want at the end. I also want to just highlight one other scene that I thought was really powerful. It's a little earlier in the film. It's between Everett and Beecham's wife, played by Lisa Gay Hamilton, who's quite good in this film, even though she doesn't have a ton to do. And when she says to him, "Where were you all this time?" And he says, "It wasn't my story. It was a mistake." And Clint is really, when Clint turns it on, and he turns it on from time to time in this film, you do get hit with like, the guy's a really fucking good actor. He just doesn't try that often. It's just, even within a film, you're like, you get like he'll give you like maybe 20% of a great performance, but like there's these moments, and that's one of them. The look on his face, the idea of like of being in over his head and feeling terrible about the situation. I don't know. It really works.
But there's no one like him. They like
No. Yeah.
as singular as they come.
Yeah. It plays to his like to the conversation that's going on in the movie too about Steve Everett versus Clint Eastwood.
Yes.
Because you've been watching a guy coast in both circumstances. And the other thing that he brings in there is a little moment of irritation that keeps coming up throughout the movie, that people aren't doing what he wants them to do. Yeah. And I don't know if that's a privilege thing or a no time thing or a drunk thing or like a recovered drunk thing who suddenly has to now he's struggling to interpret people's facial expressions in a way he didn't have to before because he just didn't care. It's sort of at odds with Steve Everett, charming womanizer, right? Because if this guy can read people so well, he'd be better at this. But it's interesting because it just puts Eastwood on the back foot and it lets him be vulnerable in a way that he doesn't seem entirely comfortable with. Like it's not romantic. It's just confused, which plays to the eighth, which actually works there too.
There's something also, we talked a little bit earlier about the procedural components and just sort of like the actual piecing together of what actually happened in the crime. And I feel like all the stuff in the convenience store just doesn't work for me. It
very 90s. That is a very 90s thing to do. To like piece out this recreation of this crime scene over the course of the movie.
A more ambitious visual palette than I think Eastwood was interested in doing.
Yeah.
It's
flash to. You need to sort of find a way to show us what the flashbacks are. You need subjectivity. You need even the high angle when it looks down over the potato chips and into the back. Yeah. It's so weird and forced. It's like I can picture three Teamsters on a ladder trying to get the shot right, and I'm not supposed to be thinking about that when it's happening.
It just doesn't. To your point, it doesn't visually pop in any way. So it doesn't actually. There's a part of me that feels like I'm not asking for for gauzy lenses or any sort of things to make it clear that it's a flashback, but some sort of an aesthetic that would give us some sense of what is real and what have you. And then especially when we see how the actual killing is played out at the end of the film, which is not really triggered by anything. Like we're just given that information at the end because we need to have it.
Right.
Plays out very strangely. The actual killing, stealing of the necklace, all that kind of stuff, all the stuff that Clint is putting together in his sort of like euphoria, this like epiphany moment, is just sort of a little not great. It just doesn't work that well. But
and we're denied the information about the necklace in the beginning, so it's weird that he knows about it. It's just one of those things that
we see her playing with it. We see the grandmother playing with it, but that's the only.
But we never see Amy. It's Amy, right?
It's Amy. Correct.
Yeah. We never see any evidence of how important it was to her. Conveyed to the police. It doesn't come up as a conversation. It's like it's not part of the trial. Why would he know about it? And it's just a hole that is never filled. And it's fine because by that point in the movie, we just need him to save the day.
Yeah,
but it's just one of those things where it's like a looped line would have fixed that. Just somewhere half an hour earlier in the film.
Yeah,
but we're on our way.
It is what it is. And then the governor. They get to the governor. They save the guy. Blah blah blah. Who knew that? By the way.
Like I thought he was the publisher of the newspaper who has
it's the governor.
No,
I thought it was the governor.
No, I think it's the
governor's ear.
He drives to the governor's house.
He drives to the governor's mansion as one does.
Had been in the film earlier as a
guy.
Think. So
correct.
That's I thought it was the publisher of the paper who's a friend of Alan's, who's the James Woods character, who has the governor's ear. But maybe it's Alan who has the governor's ear. Again, it's just, I was paying pretty
Ultimately, it doesn't totally matter. All I know is that we get a guard picking up the phone saying, but it's too late.
Right, which is so great.
Yeah, that's great.
Like, that's where you cut to black and then have the Christmas. Right?
Who knew, by the way, True Crime was a Christmas movie, guys? But it is.
Yeah.
A Christmas movie. I just watched the Godfather movies.
I did find the end to be kind of lovely and weirdly affecting, and the Lucy Liu part was okay. Well, not the Lucy Liu part. No, the Isaiah Washington part. But and the Lucy Liu part, it's another like. I know this doesn't feel like a populist thing, but I do feel like there is some weird catharsis for people who are just like, Clint, stop. Clint, stop hitting on these girls, stop. And he was like, I have a boyfriend. And it does feel right that Clint can't get this girl right now,
But also, it's like, I have a boyfriend, but is he out of town for the holidays? It's like, Clint, for the love of God.
Yes,
like,
he's a lech. He's a lech, but I'm not left with this, like, Clint's going to keep trying. I am left with this, like, the movie is telling Clint it's time to move on.
This is what I'm saying. Like, Steve Everett hasn't learned a thing. That's the great thing about the ending. That's why that coda needs to be there. We know very quickly he's still not back. Like, he didn't get back with his wife. He spent all the money from everything. Book. Whatever happened, he's managed to take the greatest accomplishment of his entire life and fuck it up off screen somehow. And all that really matters in the end is that he gets that little nod from Beecham. And that's that shouldn't be the message of this movie. That isn't the message of a pulp story about the reporter who saves the day. But that's the way the book ends. So here it is. And I think that's great. I really, also, this is amazing. In my brain, I had added a limp. I had added like some kind of post-execution damage to Beecham. Because he has that one moment where he sort of twists his body when he goes back to hug his daughter. And I thought, oh, he's limping, so he sustained some damage. So there's still some kind of like he's carrying some part of this. But no, I just made that up because I was bored in the movie theater. But there is something really moving about that moment. And it's just, I think, again, if we hadn't watched the whole ridiculous drama of racing to pull the line out of his arm, he had another line in the other arm. Like, we need to see that too.
That's the save you line. They keep that in there.
Oh, I see. Pump you full of adrenaline.
Pump you full of good stuff. Yeah.
But it is like, it's almost a great ending. It comes close.
It comes close to sticking it. I mean, honestly, I think that if they had dialed back the ending from 11 to like an 8, I think that it would have gone up several points for me in terms of the whole thing.
I don't know how to. I don't know how to defend this movie, but I kind of like the ending too. Obviously it's not great, but it's right, if that makes sense. Like, I think it does. In the absence of, and this is another thing, in the absence of great, good is good. And like, I have no problem with people just shooting, just shooting the 2-pointer, getting that basket, going back and trying again the next day. And that's what that felt like to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly after something like Absolute Power where it's just, you've both seen it, right? It swings so wide and it just missed, like that big reveal that Hackman is the president should be the most shocking, jaw-dropping thing. And I saw that with an audience that was just like, someone actually said in the background, is he important? It just doesn't land. And after that, and then the whole thing with like Clint Eastwood, Master of Disguise, and showing up at Laura Linney's graduation, and all that stuff. And then you see this where it's like, no, he's old and feeble, and he's flailing, and he's still trying to do the right thing. It's more satisfying. Like, it's just it's a more age appropriate performance from Eastwood, but it's also just a better. The bones are stronger. It's a better structure.
I agree.
You can plug into whether it works or not from moment to moment. There's enough going on in true crime that I wasn't ever as restless as I was in Garden of Good and Evil or Absolute Power or like Bloodwork, which is absolutely
I've never seen Bloodwork. So
unwatchly bad.
Bloodwork is the other one from this era that I think I'd heard of it. True crime. What a shitty title. I mean, come on. True crime?
Brutal.
Can't even Google that shit.
Do you want to rank this, Kenny? You want to go first?
Yeah, I never saw this before, never heard of it before. Was thrilled that we had a Clint movie so we could talk about Clint. Yeah. And I think we did a good job with that. My ranking was there's so much to dislike, but I'm giving it a 59. I just kind of like it. And I think I conveyed that over the course of this podcast. There's so much to dislike, but I'm giving it a 59. After the podcast, I'm going up. I liked it way more than a 59. I'm actually going to go up to it. I'm going to go up to a 69. I think I like this. I like this movie a lot better than most of the movies we've done throughout the year. It's by no means a great movie, but it is a good movie, and I want the grade to reflect that.
So I had not seen this in '99 either. I did have a vague recollection of its existence, but I mean that's being kind. I really don't remember it. I It's so funny, Kenny. I was at a 59 as well coming into this podcast. I was like, I can't. I mean, it's not bad, but like, how much did I like it? This conversation has made me like it a little bit more. I'm now at a 60. I've crossed into the 60s. I think that it's
A
got enough.
gentleman 60.
A gentleman 60. Here's the truth. It's worth watching for that fucking scene between James Woods and Dennis Leary and Clint Eastwood, because you're never going to see those three guys in a room again, I don't think. And it's got some good stuff. It's got some good scenes. The scene with him and his wife, as I mentioned, there's good stuff here. And to Kenny's point, I mentioned this, Norm, when you stepped away for a second, that when Kenny texted me, we were texting last night, I had watched about 45 minutes of the film, and I was like, yeah, it's fine. And Kenny's like, it's weird. And then I was like, I mean, that's even that weird. It's like I'm 45 minutes into it. And by the end of it, I'm like, yeah, this movie's legitimately weird. Like it's weird in interesting ways, in good ways, and in compelling ways that I gotta recommend it. I'm at a 60. But yeah. What about you, Norm? You saw this in '99.
I saw this in '99, and based on the memory, and I didn't revisit it until this week, so
Sure.
I would have gone with like a 40 in my memory, because I remember being, again, a theatrical experience of this movie. You're restless and disappointed a lot.
100%.
Although the audience was into it a little bit more than they were for Absolute Power. I just remember the energy being like more with it during the last scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Then watching it again, I would probably have gone a little higher. So 45, and I think I'm probably hovering around a 55 now, because the things that I appreciate about Eastwood's career, retrospectively, and the stuff that's still ahead of him, work in the context of this movie. Like, it's that theory I have about him making movies to prove that he should still be making movies.
Yeah,
I think there's not a lot he's done that dissuades me from believing that's right. Stuff like J. Edgar and Jersey Boys, where he's just like egregiously off base. Those are the exceptions. Those are movies he shouldn't have made, because he simply doesn't know how to make those movies.
Yeah.
But when he plays to his strengths, when he focuses on the things that interest him, and True Crime is a movie, like, he clearly wanted to make the kind of movies he grew up watching. Like, it's a 40s pulp picture, a ticking clock, a man wrongly accused, and the details are kind of not that important. He's really chasing the energy in his own sleepy, confusing way.
Yeah.
J. Edgar, I mean, we didn't talk about them a lot, but J. Edgar and Jersey Boys are two of the weirdest movies in anybody's filmography. Could you imagine Woody Allen doing something similar? These are someone
he doesn't have the ambition, right? Like, Eastwood has the ambition to attempt these gigantic projects.
Yeah.
Someone got in his ear at some point after. It must have been after Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, which is they're just such a towering achievement, even if they're not my favorite movies.
Yeah.
And someone got in his ear and said, "You're Spielberg. You can do whatever he does." Yeah. And those are two Spielberg movies. I mean, those are movies that Spielberg should have done. I mean, J. Edgar is Lincoln, and Jersey Boys is West Side Story, and they're movies that Spielberg should have done or could have done, and they're real bad attempts at that. And I'm sure he hated every moment of being on set for both of those movies.
Yeah, Jersey Boys is so fascinating, because it's the work of someone who has made a musical. Like, he's in Paint Your Wagon, right? Which we try not to acknowledge, but he knows how these things are made, and then he still makes just the most bizarre choices for Jersey Boys. Like, it's just, let's take this film and score it with the Clint Eastwood tinkling piano in the background, the noodling thing he does. Like, this True Crime has a Lenny Niehaus score. It's still got a musical. It goes wild towards the end, but at least it has the fundamentals. Like, and Eastwood wrote, I think it's also important that we point out that he co-wrote the song at the end, the Diana Krall number, over the end credits, which is terrible. But like, it's just the most direct. It is a restatement of the story. Why should I care? I don't know this guy. The world wants me to act. But that's not what the movie is about. That's what the guy who didn't really pay that much attention to the script thinks it's about. And that's the guy who made the movie. It's just this incredible contradiction of somebody who is, in this case, just like Steve Everett, he shouldn't be doing this, but he pulls it off. And I have a grudging respect for him, as opposed to something like Jersey Boys or J. Edgar, where he's just like, he should have been content to produce it and step aside. I mean, let's not forget, he was going to direct A Star Is Born for 5 years.
Yeah.
Bradley Cooper
and
with
beyond.
Bradley Cooper.
This is a man who has no idea what he should and shouldn't be doing at this point in his career, but he's still trying, which I guess is something.
Jersey Boys, while not necessarily, while it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a great film, should have been a wildly successful movie.
Oh yeah.
It should have made millions upon hundreds of millions. My parents saw the play Jersey Boys at least 8 times on Broadway. It had that kind of Titanic thing for boomers, and the fact that it was botched so badly is such a missed opportunity to make globs of money.
Yeah, I mean,
the person that I know almost did it was Favreau, which would have been interesting.
Oh, that would have been interesting. It would have been.
I mean, truly anybody else would have done a better job, and this isn't
not that hard.
It's not that hard. It's
I think who did Greatest Showman?
Oh fuck yeah! I know yeah.
I think that's my point, which is if you just got a replacement level director in there, they would have made a replacement level movie, and that's what you needed out of Jersey Boys. I think almost a Rob Marshall might have done too much with it, but
yeah. Well, I think, again, it speaks to Eastwood's lack of interest in prep. Like, if you let the second unit shoot the musical numbers, this is what happens. If you really don't care, like that, again, basically the only thing I remember about Jersey Boys now is the freeze frame at the end that isn't a freeze frame, where the camera just wanders around through all these people expecting us to be applauding because that's what happened on stage. And all you're left with is they look scared. Like, they look worried. No one knows what to do. That's why you end freeze frames with actual freeze. It was it's Police Squad, right? It's the ending of every episode of Police Squad had the fake freeze frame. Yeah. But at least those guys threw in a monkey. There was something to look at.
So next week, Kenny, we are doing a film that you are very excited to talk about. So I'm going to let you talk about it, Kenny.
Tell me what it is, and I'll talk. Oh, we're doing Beyond the Mat.
Oh, wow.
We're doing Beyond the Mat. Norm, what do you know about Beyond the Mat?
I've seen it. I liked it a lot. Who do you have for it?
We have Dave Schilling, who do you know Dave Schilling?
Name rings a bell, but I couldn't tell you where. He's
a culture writer who also happened to have written for WWE. Okay. He is a huge wrestling personality. He's a guest on Screen Drafts all the time, and he's someone that I've wanted to talk about wrestling. Talk with about wrestling for a very long time. He's one of the few people who has an inside perspective on what's gone on in that world. For those of you who don't know, Beyond the Mat is a documentary about WWE at the height of its popularity. I would not advise you to watch this movie and expect to come out of it a wrestling fan. It really shows just how horrible this industry is to the people who are doing the jobs. I don't know. It's going to be really interesting for me to hear Phil's take on this.
I'm excited. I know nothing about wrestling.
I love wrestling, but I love WWE. But it's hard to square it with the industry. The thing about wrestling and WWE is, until right now, with the advent of AEW on TNT, no one's ever tried the other approach, which is to treat people like employees, to treat people with respect, to give people health care, to do it the right way. The thing I love about WWE is there's no other wrestling. There's no other art form like it. There's no other on-the-fly, serialized, live audience. You make a mistake, you go with it. Someone gets injured, that's now part of the story. You're booing the guy who's supposed to get cheered, that's now part of the story. This is all the fly by the seat of your pants-ness of the storytelling is wildly exciting to me. But part of that is also that these performers are not treated with the respect that they should be treated with. So that those two things fighting each other has kind of been a weird war inside of me for years, because it is the only place the storytelling exists. but it's such
I am so excited to talk about this film because truly I know that Kenny has been looking forward to this film. I mean, I would argue perhaps since the beginning of this podcast.
I couldn't believe it was a 99 film. What a thrill.
How fortuitous.
So you won't believe it. You just won't believe it.
I as you know, Kenny and I yesterday did an interview for another podcast called Interview with a Podcast, where we talked about this podcast. You should go on this podcast too.
I was not aware of its existence. That sounds really cool.
And Kenny and I talked a little bit about, you know, what we love about the podcast, obviously. And one of the things I love about it, honestly, is that I get to learn about things that I don't know anything about. And this is something I know very little about. We talked a little bit about wrestling in the Play It to the Bone episode. It comes up periodically.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard you mention it over the course of the years. Yeah. I came out of it just with this amazing respect for Mick Foley, who is like just an indestructible human being. And I don't mean that in like an action hero way. I just mean in terms of spirit. That was really remarkable about that movie. Because I have absolutely no connection to wrestling. Have you done the one with David Arquette, Ready to Rumble? No,
that wasn't 99.
That was
99. It was
right around disappointment. Did you hear the palpable disappointment?
No. Ready to Rumble is very bad. Ready to Rumble.
We did the year after, right?
We did. I think around the year after. But we did do Detroit Rock City, and Ready to Rumble is the wrestling version of that. It's just a 2-hour ad for something that the whole thing makes me very uncomfortable because it presents the best possible version of this world. Yeah. But I think the three main characters of this movie are Mick Foley and Jake the Snake Roberts, and I think like The Rock, or Vince McMahon. There's kind of 4 people they focus on, and Mick Foley, you know, is the best argument for there's more going on here than meets the eye. And if you treat this art with respect, with this performance art with respect, you'll see that there's a reason that these men and women give their bodies over to it, aside from the paycheck, because it's nowhere near the level of fame that they could get, even as Hollywood stunt people sometimes. So there's something just visceral about what they do out there that I don't know. I'm going to talk about it for tomorrow.
No, I'm genuinely.
It's a weird thing.
Excited. I'm very excited to watch it.
Being a wrestling fan is like watching a James Woods movie all the time. It's that feeling all the time. No,
I'm excited to watch it.
That bad. It's crazy.
I'm excited to talk with Dave about it. But more than anything, Norm, thank you so much for coming on and talking true crime and Clint Eastwood with us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. I can't believe this is the first time I've had a chance to really unload any of that Eastwood stuff. No one has brought a film of his to my podcast in 320 episodes.
Really?
Yeah, if you can imagine.
That's really surprising.
Well,
that's very surprising.
That is not surprising. That is not surprising to me because Clint Eastwood does not engender like this obsessive reaction. Like I could see someone bring in Unforgiven, maybe.
Yeah.
I could not. I couldn't imagine someone would bring American Sniper to your podcast. But
I could see someone bringing Mystic River. There are a lot of Mystic River fans out there.
Yeah,
they almost did a $1 Million Baby episode about a year ago, but they changed their mind.
Yeah, I could see maybe the earlier ones. I could see Play Misty for me. I could see Outlaw Josie Wales, like that stuff. And I'm sure someone's brought a Sergio Leone to your podcast now.
Not yet. No.
Come on.
Yeah, seriously, I'm never sure if it's because people think that they're intimidated by the subject matter, like it's too important a film, or it's just not the favorite thing that you grab for.
Is that cool?
Once upon a time in the West.
But that's cool.
Yeah. And again, it didn't happen to change their mind.
Sergio Leone's cool. Like when we're going through our list, like there is definitely the calculus running through my head of, well, how do I want people to perceive me? And the choice I make when I get on your podcast is a big fucking deal. There's going to be a whole group of people who I've never met, and I want them to think I'm someone who loves White Man Can't Jump, not someone who loves Invictus. So. You know, I could see why.
We can clear that up right at the start if you want to. We can just put that in there.
It's damn cool. It's just be like, guys, he's cool. Okay.
I also just want to say thank you again, Norm, for letting me come on your podcast to talk about Batman Returns. That was a blast and
so glad you could do
a dream come true to be able to just talk incessantly about Michelle Pfeiffer and Catwoman, and it was great.
And I may be speaking of school a little bit, but there is a Clint movie in '89. Just saying.
Is there?
Oh my God, there is Pink Cadillac.
Yeah.
Oof. Pink Cadillac. Yeah,
I've never seen Pink Cadillac.
Talk about that, like the 80s years, the stuff like City Heat, and Pink
the
Cadillac,
Rookie, and
the
like
Rookie in
Black Heart, something or other.
White Hunter Black Heart. White Hunter Black Heart is actually, it's not a bad movie if it's not Clint Eastwood playing John Huston. If he had cast John Lithgow in that and made exactly the same film, we'd still be talking about it. It's just a total mismatch of who he is and who he's supposed to be.
I mean, Pink Cadillac doesn't exist, but I do like the idea of Clint before Unforgiven. There's something kind of rich to where he was mentally and as an artist at that point.
Yeah. Pink Cadillac also has a moment where a biker offers him a chance to snort amphetamines off a Bowie knife. And he says, "No, thank you. I'm high on life." And
that's so cool.
That should haunt him, I would say.
He honestly says what Millie says is what's a joke
for Freaks and Geeks.
Freaks and Geeks. The log line for Pink Cadillac sounds right up my alley. So I think I actually.
What is the log line?
Bernadette Peters steals her husband's pink Cadillac. She's chased by white supremacists like across the country.
I think you're going to love Pink Cadillac. I think is what we've just learned.
Well, I hope you do it. And if we do it, Norm, I'd love to have you on for it. But
I hope you make it through it.
No, it's not that.
I'll be there. No, I'll be there for you. I will help. I will be the therapist on the other side of the line for you guys.
Oh, God.
Well, we appreciate it. And thank you so much for coming on for this. We really, really do appreciate it, Norm.
Oh, anytime. Long-time listener, second-time caller. This is great.
Awesome.
Well, we can't wait to have you back for something else.